the table. Please welcome the Director General of Survival International, Stephen Corey.
Thank you very much, Mallory. It's a great honor to be invited to your somewhat crazy conference. Crazy but wonderful. It's an honor also to share a platform with Mary Pavel, who follows me, and indeed to follow the preceding presentation. So I've been asked by Mallory to say a little bit about what I've been up to in the last 4 decades or so, and I've decided I'm not going to do that. And instead, I want to look a little bit at what I've been doing and looking at very recently, because it makes some connections which I think are quite interesting and relevant. And I've got a 40-minute presentation, a bit more, 43-minute presentation if all goes well. However, there's a mistake because it depends on people being able to see the screen. And I understand we're being broadcast, as it were, on the internet or whatever it's called. And I don't know whether people are going to be able to see what's on the screen, which is quite important, on the YouTube little tiny screens. So occasionally I might need to refer to what's going on and even say some of it. But really, of course, they shouldn't have stayed at home. They should have come here. It's a great city. The sun is blazing down outside. Next time, come to Eugene. So I've entitled it, I'll need to keep turning around because I haven't got any notes. I've entitled it Whose Law, Whose Environment, or Why Darwin is Dangerously Wrong. And I thought I'd begin with this quote, which you all know, from so-called Chief Seattle, mid-19th century, very famous. This is the version actually written in the 1970s by a Hollywood scriptwriter, but it's the one which is most obviously cited. And what I thought was quite interesting is the scriptwriter has the land being sacred to Chief Seattle's people, made holy in their memory. But if you go back to the 1854, the first time it was actually written down, of course we don't know what he actually said, he simply said it's sacred. And it's been made sacred, been made holy by the presence of the people there. And I think that is quite an interesting and not so subtle difference if you think about it. And I think you find that in all kinds of shamanic traditions. The land is actually made sacred. It becomes sacred by virtue of native people living on it and with it. There are other quotations, but I'll skip them for time. So Mallory, by the way, the colours are coming out, and certainly not my choice. They're a bit strange. I don't know how it's going to work. Mallory's already introduced survival, so I will not say anything more, except what survival isn't about. It's not about keeping anybody as they are. It's not about preserving cultures. And the reason we stress that is because as soon as you say culture, as soon as you say preserving, people think you're talking about the past. People think culture is a static thing. Of course it isn't. We all know it's living, it's dynamic, it's constantly changing. It had always been constantly changing and it always will. You can't preserve anybody else's culture. You can, of course, keep elements of your own and change other elements, but you certainly can't preserve a culture. We are not-for-profit, we don't get any government money, we won't take it, and we've got offices in the States and several European countries. So what do I mean by tribal peoples? Because I'm using the term in a way which in this continent might be slightly different to how it's often used. We're talking about peoples who are still largely self-sufficient. That means basically in their housing and in their food. They don't buy those things. They don't need to buy them. They're also clearly different from the dominant society. So that is our definition. We're not talking about the wide spectrum of indigenous peoples, about 370 million individuals in the world, but a narrower sector, about 40% of that indigenous peoples sector, numbering about 150 million. We call them tribal peoples for want of something better, and it makes a certain sense in the UN documentation too. So, tribal peoples, what are they not? Well, they're not backward. They don't live like our ancestors. They don't live like their ancestors. We don't live like our ancestors. Nobody lives like their ancestors, actually. A very common mistake, very common. They're not disappearing through any kind of culture clash or meeting of cultures. They're disappearing where they are disappearing, which is in several places, by the illegal theft of principally their land, their resources. It is against the law, it's against international law, it shouldn't be happening, but it still is. They're not, obviously, brutal savages. I don't have to explain that to this audience, I'm sure. Neither are they noble savages. They're not necessarily more peaceful than we are. They're certainly not more violent. You all know that. He's come out green. Sorry about that. Of course, he didn't mean it. What he meant was all white men are created equal. And that is very easy to see in other stuff about him. Can you read that at the back? Yeah? Okay. Well, I won't need to read it then. Black people are certainly not equal. They are an inferior species, probably. So what about this chap? He, remember, is writing science. This is a scientific book. Here he's talking about people he calls the Fuegians. These are the Indians of the southern tip of South America, from Tierra del Fuego, which he visited. And you'll see what he says about them. Now we come to an American. We fast forward, from Jefferson we've gone a century forward to Darwin. Now we go a generation forward to a famous, very famous in his time, American lawyer and conservationist. Madison Grant, he had a terribly impressive resume. Trustee of the Natural History Museum, founder of Bronx Zoo, a gold medalist, trustee of the Zoological Society. He had a species of caribou named after him. He was a founder of Save the Redwoods. He had the world's largest tree was dedicated to him and a couple of others. He was a close friend of the president, Theodore Roosevelt, and on this side of what he did, he's primarily known for being instrumental in the creation of these national parks. If you look at a fuller list of the organizations he was involved in at an executive level, it's even more impressive. So if you look a bit closer, you'll see some curious things. The Boone and Crockett Club, eugenics, immigration restriction. So what's that all about? This is the Boone and Crockett Club. Boone and Crockett Club's still going. This is from its website a couple of days ago. As you can see, it characterizes itself as a conservation organization. And it's also proud of its role in the creation of various national parks. You have to look pretty hard to see what it's really all about. It's an organization of sport hunters, and it was founded by Teddy Roosevelt. Madison Grant was a very prominent member of it. You won't, however, find old Grant in the website because he's been removed, although he was a very prominent member, president, and all the rest of it for many years. He's been airbrushed out of history, as indeed he has from most of the organizations he played such an important role in. Why was that? Oh, Boone and Crockett, of course, the name it's all given away in the name. It's Davy Crockett and it's Daniel Boone. That's why it's called Boone and Crockett, famous frontiersmen, hunters, involved in several Indian wars as well. So the creation of the national parks, which of course started here in this country, involved the eviction of the tribal peoples who were living on the land or using it seasonally. How does all this tie together? Why do sport hunters suddenly turn into people who want to restrict immigration? Well, in fact, if you follow the trajectory, it's quite clear. The principal people they want to stop hunting are other hunters, commercial hunters, people who kill the bison, people who are hunting for meat, for large-scale meat, for selling it, and so on and so forth. So the principal thing they wanted, the first thing they need to do to preserve their herds for their trophy hunting is stop the commercial hunting. So you create nature reserves, keep the commercial hunters out, get rid of the tribal people. They then removed the natural predators, wolves, coyotes, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, as we now know, was disastrous because it increased the size of the herd beyond the carrying capacity of the land. So the herd then grows weaker, lots of sick members, and so on and so forth. So then they invented game management, which basically means you kill the weaker members of the herd. All well and good. The principles of game management were worked out, which were worked out, then exactly the same as they use today. There's a problem then because many of them went rather further. And they thought, well, we've got to manage the human herd too. So that's why he was instrumental in getting through anti-immigration legislation. He wanted immigration to come from Northern Europe and not from South and Eastern Europe. Why? Because he characterized people into species and subspecies. Of course, lots of other people were. He's carrying on a long tradition, which had been going on since Darwin and before. But you will see, this is a great simplification, by the way. His work is extremely complex. Again, it's scientific, of course. So you can see that the basic species are white, black, and everybody else. But if you follow the white species, the so-called Caucasians, you come to subspecies, Nordics, Mediterraneans, and Alpines. And this is one of his several maps showing you how that arose. The Nordics are green. They weren't on the original, never mind. They're sort of fluorescent green. The sort of yellowish are so-called Alpines, and the brown are the, who are they? They're the Mediterranean, the yellow of the Mediterranean is the brown of the Alpines. So the brown, you notice, they're the poor countries of Europe, southern Europe, South Italy, Greece, Sicily, also the Jewish areas. And this is where, of course, immigration was coming into the United States when he was getting through these anti-immigration bills. He's got lots of maps, actually. Nordics is the same as Aryans, same as Teutons. He's got lots of maps showing you how all this arose historically, and I mean lots. They are 99% rubbish, but they were accepted at the time. Of course, the problem with immigration and how it relates to game management is simply that. You mate a big bison with a little bison, you get something in between. It's always smaller than the big one. Or, to put it another way, the offspring are not so high as the higher parent. Of course, this is an era when racism was commonly accepted. I think probably very few white Europeans or those of white European descent, certainly Nordics, did not believe in these kinds of racist ideas. It was common. And you can see it in postcards, America 1913. This is French from 1900, I think. These are British, also about Jews, but you can find them about other races. You can see the same thing in adverts. Here's one from 1915. It's for a holiday resort. No Hebrews, that's no Jews, need apply. And this is, again, I repeat, commonly accepted at the time. So, you can control immigration to keep your herd healthy. And you can see why they were so alarmed. In 1860, almost all the immigrants were coming from the Nordic countries, but from 1880, for several decades, the proportion of southern European immigrants, Jews, Eastern Europeans, Greeks, Sicilians, southern Italians, so on and so forth, was growing and growing and growing to the point where it crossed, which is the point where the Immigration Restriction League was founded by Madison Grant, fighting for quotas, which they eventually got into law, which then reversed that trend. So, back to how you control the herd. One way, control immigration. And it wasn't until 1967 that the anti-miscegenation laws were made, I've jumped a slide there, illegal in the States. See if it'll work going back. Oh yes, the second way you can control the herd, improve the herd, is you stop interracial marriage, which is indeed what happened in several countries, including the States. And this is a graph much more recent, 58 for the next 50 years. So that's basically less than my lifetime. And you can see that the ratings, people almost always disapproved of interracial marriage when I was a child. The vast majority of people now approve of it. There are other ways. You can sterilize people. This was common in the United States in compulsory sterilization laws. Went on in Oregon until 1981. Concentrated on the mentally ill, also the deaf, blind, epileptics, deformed, lots of Native American and African American women. In California, about 10,000 women forcibly, compulsorily sterilized for being described as things like bad girls, passionate, oversexed. And it took a great boost in 1927 when Supreme Court Justice Holmes came out with that remark that it's actually better to get them before they're born, then you won't need to execute them later. Or, a couple of years before Justice Holmes, Hitler put it actually rather simpler and more straightforwardly. But notice also how it's the most humane task that mankind faces. The bad guys don't think they're bad. So, 3 methods, and of course there's the obvious 4th method of preserving the health of the herd, killing the weaker members. Now I jump continents, Southwest Africa, it's now Namibia. I'm talking about the beginning of the century when it was German Southwest Africa. And we'll meet General von Trotha in 1904, and these were his remarks about what he proposed to do to the Herero and Nama and some Bushman tribes. Basically destroy them with streams of blood and money, sparing no one. And that is indeed what happened. Nobody knows how many people were killed, several tens of thousands. It was gruesome, bloody, and everything that you can imagine in your worst dreams. The Brits did a report on it in 1918, but 8 years later they destroyed the report because they wanted to foment better relations with the German settlers. By this stage they were running what was German Southwest Africa. So the report's whitewashed and the genocide disappears. And if you now put in a Google search, at least when I put in a Google search, 20th century genocide, you get this list here. You don't get any mention of the German genocide. You do get an interesting quote from Hitler about the Armenians. That was the Turkish genocide starting in 1915. As Hitler said, nobody remembers the Armenians, and certainly nobody remembers the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in German Southwest Africa. And that continues to this day. This is Madison Grant's book, 1916. It had a lot of admirers. One of, you can extract almost anywhere from the book, actually, but as you can see, Negroes have demonstrated their stationary species. This is Hitler's book, 10 years later, with a conscious and direct reference to the fact that they were copying what was going on in the States. And you can see that again in lots of different stuff. The connection between the Herero genocide and the genocide of the 1930s and 40s is direct. Heinrich Goering, governor of German Southwest Africa, father of Hermann Goering, Hitler's deputy. But perhaps, and there are lots of connections like this, I mean, I really do mean lots, but a good one to point out is this Dr. Eugen Fischer. He was studying African children who had sterilized in 1908, got rid of the Jews from Berlin University in 1933, studied other children in Germany, so-called mixed-race Germany in the Rhineland, who were subsequently sterilized. All of them were sterilized. And then after the war became president of the German Anthropological Society. A poster, Nancy poster, we're not standing alone. The shield is, of course, their sterilization law. And on the left, the countries that also have sterilization laws with the United States at the top. And if you're in any doubt, we should look at Herr Brandt, or Dr. Brandt here, in charge of the German sterilization program. When he was put on trial by the Americans after the war, he could not understand why he was being tried by a country which had practiced exactly the same things in the sterilization area. And he referred to this in his defense. This is a paper from his defense. He cites Madison Grant's book, and he quotes from it. Now, is all this past history? Well, not really. Here's a Brazilian deputy, government deputy, filmed about 6 weeks ago.
Eu quero dizer para vocês, o mesmo governo, seu Gilberto Carvalho, também é ministro da presidenta Dilma. E é ali que estão aninhados quilombolas, índios, gays, lésbicas, tudo que não presta está ali está alinhado e eles têm a direção e têm o comando do governo.
If you compare the list with those targeted by the Nazis, you really only need to add Jews and Gypsies and you come to the same kinds of people. There are fierce now anti-Indian movements going on in Brazil. Back to Africa, this is Botswana. It happens to be the neighbor of Namibia, but that's a coincidence. In the center, it's come out green, is the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. And this is the second largest game reserve in the world, twice the size of one American state, I can't remember which. Never mind. It's huge. The Bushmen were evicted from this land in 2002. Practically all of them, but a dozen managed to evade eviction. Diamonds had been discovered 30 years before, 20 years before, which is what it was all about, although the government said it was for conservation reasons. They were damaging the game. Survival, anyway, supported them taking the government to court. It was the longest, most expensive case in Botswana's legal history, went on for 4 years. Finally, the Bushmen, somewhat to everybody's surprise, actually won the right to live in the game reserve. And we have a picture of them celebrating that with the young character who's also, everybody's green, perhaps that's not inappropriate. The young guy has his I Love CKG, Central Kalahari Game Reserve t-shirt on, which Survival got for them. The government is still trying to get the Bushmen out of the reserve, and the latest ploy is ban all hunting throughout Botswana. But before we come on to that, adjacent to the reserve, it's not in the reserve, it's adjacent, there's an area which Conservation International has been trying to turn into a game corridor for years. And they did a study which ran for several years, costing several millions. In this area, there's a Bushman community, and the government said it would evict them. We took that case to court too and stopped that. During the process of all that, we asked Conservation International, well, hang on, you knew these evictions had happened. You couldn't have missed them. It was the biggest news story in Botswana and ran for about 2 years. Surely you incorporated some thoughts about this when you were studying this new so-called conservation area. And after not very fruitful correspondence, they put this up on their website. And you can see that they have great principles of consultation and community engagement, which guide them. Whoever did this doesn't seem to have noticed that they also say they had no direct engagements with the community at all. And this, as I say, was a study which lasted for several years and cost millions. It's unfair to pick on Conservation International, of course. We could talk about WWF, we could talk about the eviction of tribal peoples going on today from so-called tiger reserves in India, where there are virtually no, perhaps in some cases, no tigers. It's all about clearing the local people out for forest clearance, really. We could talk about their support for so-called eco-guards in Cameroon, indirectly through the government, but nevertheless, it's their money which funds the government, and how those eco-guards are beating up, torturing pygmies who are thought to have gone into the conservation zones where they, of course, had always lived. Or we could just look at their board and see who controls it and wonder why these organizations, it's the same with Conservation International, it's the same with a lot of them, why are they controlled by these people who are basically corporate leaders from oil and energy, automobiles, finance, and so on and so forth? Well, of course, it always has been. This organisation was formed as a coordination between the corporate and the government sector. Or, a couple of weeks ago in London, we have some green royal gentlemen uniting against poaching, and in the front row, there's President Khama, evicted the Bushmen, has now made Bushman hunting illegal throughout Botswana. You might ask what these three gentlemen at the top do when they're not against poaching. I don't know if they've heard of Madison Grant. And actually, the two younger ones were hunting 2 days before they did the announcement. They're not the only European royals, of course. Here's the King of Spain. Oh, by the way, Prince Charles is now the president of WWF International. As this character, Juan Carlos, King of Spain, was president of WWF Spain until this story came out a couple of years ago. So, President Khama's banned all hunting, except, of course, sport hunting. So if your people have lived by hunting for generations, you can't do it. But if you can go and pay your money, then you can. So here's a letter from me to a Sunday newspaper that more or less puts paid to my chances of ever being off the knighthood. But On the other hand, I only really wanted an earldom, and they don't give or even sell those anymore. So that comes to my first kind of plea. Can you read that? It's fluorescent. It's addressed to conservation organisations. Please stop supporting the eviction of tribal peoples from conservation zones. It can kill them, and it does. The irony, of course, is that actually these are the best conservationists, and you can now prove that definitively from satellite imagery. Here's a picture of eastern Amazonia. Now the black areas are now the deforested areas. The areas with numbers are the indigenous reserves. They are forested. They should be green, but the machine has done its colour changes. So you can see that the only areas which are not deforested are the indigenous reserves. Back to remind you of that graph, change in attitudes about interracial marriage, and my wishful thinking goes to a graph which changes attitudes about evicting tribal peoples from conservation zones. I've given that a 10-year span. Realistic, who knows? Steven Pinker, a very well-known popular science writer. Of course, he is not a racist, nor is the next guy I'm going to be talking about. But nevertheless, look at what they say. They are saying that tribal peoples kill more people in war than states do. And here are his graphs. So they're all very scientific. Here are his graphs to prove it. It's completely spurious. Those are supposed to be hunter-gatherers. You can't read that, I know. And then at the bottom is states. So those lines are the amount of people killed in war by these different kinds of societies. The categories are spurious and absurd. I could demonstrate that, but I haven't got time. So I'll just look at one line there, which is the longest. These are the people who kill most people, more people than anybody else in warfare. They're called the Waorani. They're a tribe in Ecuador. I was with them 32 years ago. And they do have a strong tradition of feuding, which does result in a lot of people getting killed, or did then. That has almost entirely stopped. But from a most unlikely source, you can see peoples who, even before I was there, 40 years ago, understood why this might be. And this was evangelical missionaries who produced a comic book in 73, showing you the Aucas is an old derogatory name for the Waorani. These are the same people. They had been attacked by the Spanish, they'd been attacked by rubber tappers, they had a legacy of hatred. So there might be some reason why there is a lot of killing within the Waorani which has escaped Pinker. Or Jared Diamond. He thinks tribal societies offer us a window into how our ancestors lived for millions of years. I don't know how much we know about human evolution, but it is laughable if, again, this wasn't supposed to be science and enormously popular and indeed highly respected. I stress again, I don't want any lawsuits. Neither Jared Diamond nor Steven Pinker are racists. If there are any lawsuits, then I'll rely on the University of Oregon Law School. What is the difference between what they're saying and what Darwin said? Well, it's a bit different. To me, it doesn't really seem that different, to be honest. I think they are winding the clock back here about 150 years, and I think we have to be very careful. So here's my second sort of wish list, and it's addressed to popular science writers. Please stop claiming tribal peoples are like our ancestors and are more violent than we are. It can kill them, and it does. And I could talk about how that connection is made if I had more time, which I don't. Anyway, I hope I'll be invited back to your fantastic city in the future. That's just a plug. If you want more on what we think of Pinker and Diamond. You can find it on our website. Just put brutal into a search engine on the Survival website. There's another plug for a book of mine, which is an introduction to tribal peoples. It may be on sale here, but there are legal issues. Anyway, that's the second edition. The one here is the first edition. I've only got a handful of copies. You can have it cheap, impoverished Oregon students, half price, overpaid Oregon lawyers, double. And a final plug, Davi Kopenawa is the most well-known Yanomami shaman from the north of Brazil. He's just had a book out by University of Harvard Press. A very big book. It's the most detailed explanation of the Amazonian shamanism there has ever been or probably will ever be. And he's coming to San Francisco in April. If you're interested, put his name or something like that into the Survival search engine and you'll get details. So, to end, this is a big subject, obviously. You can't do it in 40 minutes, so what about 2.5 minutes? So we've done this book, which is designed to be read in 2.5 minutes, which goes through some of these issues, not all of them. Don't blink, we've animated it, that last 2.5 minutes, so I'm going to play it. Don't blink because you'll miss the bit about conservation, which is about 2 minutes in. We're not getting sound. If we don't get sound, it won't make any sense.
As we set out through the dense jungle, we had but one goal in mind: to bring the people sustainable
I
development.
don't know how to...
However, in this case, we did encounter an unexpected...
We are, of course, in the United States, land of technological excellence. But it's not my fault, so I can say that. It wouldn't work in England either. But it does work if it all hooks up right. We had sound for the Brazilian. Do you think you might have sound? Let me...
As we set out through the dense jungle, we had but one goal in mind: to bring the people sustainable development. However, in this case, we did encounter an unexpected challenge. We discovered that these people, in their own peculiar kind of way, were already sustainable. So all we could really bring them was development. We started by taking them through the process of participatory community project building, but they refused to fully participate. Next, we tried income-generating activities, but for some strange reason, they seemed satisfied with less than $1 a day. We even tried empowering them, but their reaction was much more powerful than we expected. But we weren't going to give up on these people so easily. We knew they needed our help, even if they weren't aware of it. So we opted for the multi-stakeholder cross-disciplinary approach. We developed innovative private sector partnerships. Then we taught the people vocational skills that were adapted to a shifting economy. We created tough conservation measures to protect the environment from further harm. And we developed ambitious social safety nets to protect those unable to care for themselves. I'd say it's been a challenging process. We've learned many important lessons, and we really look forward to applying them elsewhere in the future. But for now, let us just say, welcome to the global village.
So a final wish list. If you think governments, corporations and conservation organisations should actually follow their own policies and laws, say so. Thanks.